Hi, and welcome to the Security Strategist, where we have a weekly conversation with people who are impacting the enterprise tech landscape. My name is Alejandro Leal. I am an analyst at KuppingerCole, and I've been covering cybersecurity and digital identity topics over the past few years. Today, I would like to welcome Vivin Sathyan, Senior Technology Evangelist. How are you, Vivin?
I'm doing good, Alex. Thank you for having me. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
So, as businesses embrace digital transformation and become increasingly cloud native, mobile, and interconnected, the corporate network perimeter is gradually disappearing, exposing users to malware, ransomware, and other cyber threats. How have the challenges and disadvantages of a perimeter based approach to identity security evolved in the post pandemic landscape?
Right. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you, EM360, for this wonderful opportunity. So I hope our time spent here adds some value to the listeners. All right, let's get started. First things, well, what are the challenges and disadvantages of perimeter-based approach, and have they evolved? The answer is definitely yes, a big, bold yes. And I believe they are primarily due to two reasons. One is increased reliance on cloud technologies, which was very obvious. Now, why did that happen? Well, shift to remote work. So we had more and more organizations going remote. I mean, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch if I say more than 80% of the organizations had to go remote. And in that mix, organizations did whatever they could in order to make sure the business was up and running. So it was all about business continuity, right? So it also gave way for some vulnerabilities, or it actually exposed some of the vulnerabilities that traditional security models had, right? And you asked about the vulnerabilities. Now, I don't have a list here in any particular order, but let's say 4 points. Okay, point number one was broader access. Now, in order to facilitate remote work, many organizations accidentally, I wouldn't say they did it on purpose, accidentally granted excessive permissions to users. Right now, that led to potential misuse of access rights. So this over-provisioning or broader access has made it easier for the not-so-good guys to exploit these permissions or access rights and gain unauthorized access to sensitive information. Now, as a subsequent event, when you give broader access, the immediate impact or the direct correlation of event is increase in the number of insider threats, right? And the third vulnerability is I think is applicable to almost all the organizations, or it's safer to say at least to 80% of the organizations, which is the weakness in VPN. We depended on VPN a lot, especially during remote work, right? And VPN obviously gave us secure access, secure remote access. Well, that's debatable, but it actually got the job done. Well, flip side is you had some issues with VPN, right, which is a traditional security approach. Now, what is the issue? Well, split tunneling. Now, what do I mean by split tunneling is I connect to the corporate network using VPN while I'm working from home. I just don't connect to the corporate network. Connecting to the corporate network, let's say it's just one branch. The other branch is I actually access internet, right? So we have two branches here, and the VPN is split into two branches. And accessing the internet could be safe or it could be unsafe, depending on how cyber aware we are. So if I click on something that I'm not supposed to click or download something that I'm not supposed to download while I'm working on a VPN connection, that in turn impacts my corporate resources as well, right? And last but not the least, in terms of vulnerability, the complex of cloud environments, the complexity that the cloud environments bring in. Now, just imagine the number of SaaS applications that were onboarded, especially during the remote workforce thing, when it was in full speed, right? So we had multiple SaaS applications getting onboarded. So it became a lot more difficult for the administrators to come up with some sort of consistent policies and apply it to your on-prem, apply it to your hybrid and your SaaS infrastructure, and thereby monitor user activity effectively or manage user activity. So these were some of the vulnerabilities, Alex. Over to you.
Great. Well, you mentioned networks, and I think it's important to highlight that zero trust is not just about networks, but about users, devices, systems, and applications, and even data. It is about continuous verification of device security and identity authentication. So, could you tell me what are the critical components of zero trust, particularly in the context of identity security, and how do they differ from traditional security protocols?
Well, that's the thing. So with zero trust, I mean, obviously, zero trust was the answer for the previous challenge that we were talking about. And even though zero trust is not a new concept, I mean, John Kinderberg came up with the whole concept of zero trust somewhere in the middle of 2010 or 2011, if I'm not wrong. So it's been almost 13 or 14 years. But zero trust has been around, but it gained traction just because we had increased remote workforce and the vulnerabilities that came with that, right? So if you ask me, well, how do they differ? How does the main components of zero trust differ from the traditional security methodologies? Again, I have 3 or 4 points that clearly differentiates these two methods. Number one is explicit verification. All of us know that zero trust requires explicit verification of every user, every device, and application attempting to access the resources, regardless of your location or network. Now, let me repeat, regardless of your location or network. Now, why did I repeat that? Because the traditional approach was if you are working from a certain location or if you are in a certain network, the trust was implicit, right? So you were trusted by default. And what do I gain? Well, if you are trusted, then you gain access to the resources that are mapped to you. So unconditional access, as I call it, right? So that's not the case with zero trust. Okay, that's one differentiation. The second one is least privilege access. Okay? For example, Z2 enforces the principle of LP or least privilege, wherein you grant users the minimum access required to perform their task. Whereas when you take a look at the traditional security methodology, it was broad access, which then paved way to something called as lateral movement, right? So I compromise one part and then I move across your network laterally, right? Whereas in the case of ZT, if you give me least privilege, even if my account is compromised, worst case, the chances of lateral movement is very slim. I'm not saying there are no chances of lateral movement. That would be not the right answer, but the chances are very slim. And the third is the ability to continuously monitor and validate, right? It's not about I trust you, I let you in, and then I don't validate you again. So it's all about continuous verification. And whenever an anomaly is detected in a user's behavior or a device's behavior or the application is kind of acting a bit, a bit sketchy, then threat mitigation came into place. So all these were not there, if not effectively, so they were not there in the traditional methodologies. And the last point here is the access policies are a lot more adaptive. Now, what do I mean by adaptive is we don't look at a user's username and password, they hit enter, and if that's right, well, you are in. It's not the case anymore. So we look at the user's identity, the risk score, and the second thing, we look at the device health, we look at the location, we look at the IP address, we look at anomalous behaviors, what is normal, what is not normal. Based on these parameters, an access policy is mapped to the user so that the user is challenged enough and then he or she gains access to the network, which is unlike the traditional security, which was more of static perimeter based policies. Well, these are some of the, let's say, key components, I would say, that differentiate ZT with the traditional protocols.
Okay. Yeah. Could you tell me how crucial is a layer-based approach that spans user, application, device, and network security?
All right, good question again. Because now that we're talking about ZT, ZT, according to me, is more effective when you actually apply ZT or the principles of ZT in layers. Now, what do I mean by layers is, let's say for better understanding, I'll start with the base layer, which is the user. So we are now focusing on user security and users access devices. So we have to now focus on device security, and devices give you access to applications. Then we are going to be talking about application security, of course, data as well. And all these three, users, devices, and applications, they are part of a network. So we'll have to focus on network security as well. Okay, ZT allows us to do this, right? And what are the benefits of this multi-layered defense strategy? Well, the benefits are quite obvious. Number one is increased protection. Example, when I focus on multi-layered security, even if one of the layers are compromised, let's say the user layer is compromised, I still can manage to actually build up better defense protocols using the device, using the application and the network layer, right? Now that leads to the reduction in the overall attack surface. It's not broader attack surface anymore because I'm focusing on layers. And number three is we will be able to focus on newer threats because we have now separated every entity as an individual group, and then we are now focusing on them. And when the focus is there, we will be able to better identify and mitigate newer threats, thereby compliance management and risk management becomes a lot more easier. So these are some of the benefits. And you also asked me about the challenges. Well, challenges, obvious again. Number one, it could be a bit complex to implement and manage multiple security layers because there is a lot of knowledge transfer that has to happen and manpower, so on and so forth. Number two is integration. So when you're actually focusing on multiple layers, these individual layers and the security tools that you apply to on these layers have to integrate so that they don't operate on silos. So if I get hit in the user layer, then that information should immediately transfer to the other layers for correlation, and I should be getting a holistic picture of what is going on, right? So integration. And the last point is the cost and the resource constraints that are attached to the multi-layered security approach. So that's my take, Alex.
Yeah, you already mentioned this, but I think it's important to repeat again that one of the fundamental misconceptions that industry experts are struggling to explain to the public is that zero trust is not an off-the-shelf product, right? It's not about getting the ultimate solution, but it's a journey that begins with a long-term business strategy and focuses on a step-by-step implementation
Absolutely.
using existing or already available tools and technologies while maintaining the continuity of the business. And of course, it's important to avoid adding even more complexity to the existing architecture of an organization. Could
Exactly.
you tell me what are the most common vulnerabilities associated with users, and how can organizations better protect against these risks at the identity level?
Absolutely. So before that, I'd also like to touch upon some of the points that you just mentioned. You rightly mentioned zero trust is a journey and it's not a protocol or a method. So it's all about policies that we have already been used to, but fine tuning them and then bringing all of those together. So it's just that. Now, despite that, why do people shun away from zero trust? Now, it was the case, let's say, 5 or 6 years ago, but now things are changing. Zero trust is slowly gaining traction. But earlier, people used to shun away from adopting zero trust. One of the reasons, what I believe is, or what I understand is, the marketing spin around zero trust was so much so that if you asked 5 people the definition of zero trust, they'll give you 8 definitions, right? So everyone had their own version of zero trust. So it was a kind of a confused approach. And that's why most organizations, there's a saying in IT that goes like, when something is not broken, don't try and fix it, right? So as long as it is working, let it keep working. So your question, right? It was about how do we actually better protect organizations against threats at the identity level? It's good that you asked the question because when you talk about identity, my mind immediately goes to user identities. Why user identities? Well, you could probably ask the audience a very simple question, and I'm 100% sure that some of them will be smiling. Okay. Have you used password at 123 as your password in the last 18 to 24 months? Okay. If this is the question I pose, I'm 100% sure that we would have some smiling faces in the listeners, right? So humans are the weakest link. So when you talk about identity security, it is always wise to start from the user layer and then move up the ladder. Now, what do you do? Okay. Some of the common vulnerabilities to address would be, number one is weak authentication. I'm not sure whether all the organizations are 100% passwordless. We still have organizations that use passwords. When I say organizations, users using passwords for legacy, for support of legacy applications. So removing compromised passwords and enforcing MFA not just for endpoint login, but also for application login, while initiating remote access, while doing operations, sensitive operations like resetting password for your high privileged accounts, so on and so forth. So you should have MFA not just in one place, but in crucial places. That's about the weak authentication part when it comes to vulnerabilities. And then immediately when you talk about weak authentication, the next vulnerability is that of insider threats, right? So what I do is in ManageEngine, I am a technology consultant. I also do risk assessment and health check for organizations. And when I actually scan an Active Directory infrastructure, be it on-prem or hybrid, some of the cases that I see are, number one, you have terminated accounts, but those terminated accounts still retain access to your resources, right? Number two, negligent employees falling for traditional phishing scams. And number three is you have insiders abusing legitimate access privileges just because it was given to them in a broader context. And the third vulnerability and the most common is privilege escalation, right? So you have a regular user, and day one, that's a regular user. Day 180, the same regular user has an indirect administrative access, right? You'll be able to find all these when you perform Active Directory risk assessment, and I have seen this. And associated to this, which is privilege escalation, is misconfigured access controls, right? You have some settings that have been not handled properly, and that is kind of a high risk situation. And the last, which is the classic, is unpatched vulnerabilities that allow privilege escalation. So these are some of the vulnerabilities that I see with identity security. I mean, the list is big, but these are some of the things that come to the top of my mind. And how do we prevent them? Well, go back to the basics, right? The first thing that I would request the listeners to do is please have a risk assessment procedure in place, especially for your Active Directory, on-prem or hybrid. It doesn't matter, because I really believe that Active Directory is widely used. At least more than 60% of the organizations use Active Directory if you are medium and large business. So understanding the security posture of Active Directory is important. That's step number one. Number two, enforce strong password policies. Of course, you can use passkeys and all that, but if you are still using passwords, I want that to be strong and applied across the board. Now, what do I mean by that? You have to apply it for your on-prem. You have to have the same policy covering your hybrid infrastructure as well. Number three, monitor user behavior for anomalies. Okay. Well, I could give you my username and password, and I could ask you to work with my laptop for 30 minutes. Your behavior in my laptop is going to be very much different from my behavior in the same laptop, right? So we have to understand behaviors here, not just look at events, but a behavior. The last point, context-based employee training, right? Why do I say context-based? Because we have employee training happening in almost all organizations, but are they context-based? Some of the training materials are missing the context. They are just there for the sake of it. So we have to move from that approach and go to more practical training. So maybe having a red teaming, blue teaming effort helps. So these are some of my take, Alex. I know this is a long answer.
No, it was a great answer. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm happy that you mentioned passwordless, because That's one of the topics that I've been covering over the past year or so at KuppingerCole. And in our latest research, we found out that approximately more than 70% of organizations are using MFA with passwords, and around 15% are already implementing passwordless, while the other 50% are still using username/passwords. And like you said, getting rid of passwords is a critical component of taking on this zero trust journey. And one of the main topics of conversation that I've had this past year with many of these passwordless vendors is to, most of them are still offering the option of username password for authentication and for account recovery as well. And they tell me that they just want to provide that to their customers because some of them, they're used to it. They like using username and password. But if we really want to embrace this passwordless future and this zero trust journey, I think that many of the vendors out there need to come up with alternative methods. And it will be better to just educate customers on the security risks of username and passwords. So yeah, I think you mentioned really, really important points there. And maybe the final question would be, as a software vendor, how does ManageEngine help translate zero trust philosophy into actionable steps?
All right. Thank you, Alejandro. So, what we do at ManageEngine, I mean, by the way, ManageEngine has been around for more than 20 years now, and we are obviously a software vendor. We also focus on two things. One is we actively listen to the customers. And by that, I'm not saying we are the best company out there with best customer response and alertness and all that. No, that's not my claim. We try and understand what the customers are saying, and we try to give them a solution in the form of, let's say, software, right? So that's one thing that we do. And apart from that, we also look at the twists and turns in the market. So how is the market progressing? When you say remote work, well, what's happening with remote work? What is the flip side? What are the pros? What are the cons? And if there are any cons, can we actually come up with some sort of solution? So we also have some sort of a layered approach when it comes to building products for our customers. Okay? For instance, we have close to 50 products on-prem and cloud-based solutions. Okay. Now, broadly classifying these 50 products, we have user security products that enforce MFA, adaptive MFA, risk-based MFA, device scoring, user action audit, activity auditing, basically giving you answers for who, what, when, and where. That's for the user security part. And for application security, we have MDM, we have patching solutions, and we talk about encryption and all that, right? And when it comes to, let's say, device security, obviously encryption, patching, and MDM and all that applies there too. And the last part, network. So focusing on the network layer, we have network monitoring solutions that could obviously help you understand the overall health of your network, detect anomalies, and take mitigation procedures, if at all that's required, based on widely available playbooks. So we have a mixed approach, or rather, I would say we have a flexible approach when it comes to providing solutions. Before 20 or 22 years, when we started building products, it was all point products, right? So the customers came up with one problem, we gave them one solution. Now, after 20 years, and we have thousands of customers with us, what has happened here is the ecosystem has evolved so much so that now customers, our clients, they are not just working with one solution from ManageEngine, they are working with multiple solutions. So we are now focusing on contextually integrating the security products to give an easy experience or a seamless experience for the end users. And we are not going to stay away from the context just because we are talking about integration. So that's pretty much what we do. So 50 products that can act as standalone if that's your requirement, or if you have onboarded multiple products from us, we will be able to actually integrate them contextually and act as a platform on top of which you could build your own SOC, or let's say tools that could facilitate better SOC management. So that's about it, Alex.
All right. On that positive note, I think I'll end the podcast. So thank you, Vivin, so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you coming on, and thank you to everyone listening. We hope you took a lot away from today's podcast. For further information on what we talked about, please head over to ManageEngine.com. And of course, we'll be back next week with another episode in our podcast series. Until then, make sure you subscribe to this podcast on all major platforms and follow the conversation on our socials at EM360Tech on X and LinkedIn. And for more great daily content, head over to m360tech.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alex, and you take care.